space in a parish in Bishop. So we managed to find the four of us a month in advance to come here without a group, without a schedule. And so I got the thing well, basically from the east, from the west side of Australia to the east is migration itself. So what were your ways of adapting to your role and responsibility and in that dynamic?
You mean moving from one side of the country to the other, or?
Well, staying religiously active, developing that sensitivity.
Oh, I see. Yep. Okay. I'm not sure if I've quite understood, but let me have a go, and then if I haven't answered it properly, ask me again. But I was born and grew up in Melbourne, which is on the southeastern corner of Australia. I was, all my life pretty well was there, except for a few years in other places. And then 4 years ago, I was appointed as the Archbishop of Perth. So I had to leave one side of the country, go to the other side of the country. I had a few friends in Perth because I had lived there for a couple of years. Oh, thank you. I had a few friends in Perth. I'd lived there for a couple of years. But my family's in Melbourne. All my friends pretty well are in Melbourne. I belong to a religious order, the Salesians of Don Bosco, and they don't have a presence in Perth, so I'm the only one. So I don't have my religious community there either. And Perth is a bit different from the rest of the country. When I was first appointed as a parish priest in Perth, I was only there for 4 years, about 20 years ago now. I remember after the first Mass on the Saturday evening, I was standing outside the church saying hello to people, and someone came up, and he was being quite genuine. He wasn't trying to be, funny or anything. He said, Father, sorry, I was a priest then. Father, welcome to Perth. We use the same money and we speak the same language, but otherwise it's a different country over here. And we have the auxiliary bishop from Perth down the back there, and he can testify that it's a very different country to the other side of Australia. I did find it difficult to adapt, mainly I think because my family were in Melbourne, my religious community was in Melbourne, so I was a bit isolated. But what I decided to do was to spend whatever time I needed trying to get to know the place and the people as well as I could, because I think the only way you can be an effective preacher of the gospel, whether you're a priest or a bishop or a religious or a married person or whatever situation you might find yourself in, the only way you can be an effective sharer of your faith is if you know the local people and the local situation. And I think that's also true for each one of you in your own local scene. And it's exactly what I was trying to get at in relating to those three stories. In those three stories, Jesus was both human and divine. He had a bit of a head start on us. But Jesus had this extraordinary ability to understand where somebody was at and start from there. He knew exactly the situation of Zacchaeus. He wasn't trying to pretend that Zacchaeus was something he wasn't. He wasn't trying to do anything else but start with Zacchaeus where he was at and ask himself, what can I do to get the message across to this guy in his situation that he matters? So I think one of the challenges, I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but one of the challenges when we're trying to share our faith is to know the people to whom we're trying to share our faith, know their situation, try and understand where they're at, and start from there. The example I sometimes use is that, a person could be the best speaker in the world. Say we had a bishop here who was a hero of the faith in China. Lived an incredible life, given up everything, was a hero of the faith in China, and he came here to give the catechesis, and all he could speak was Cantonese. He might have preached a very powerful homily, but it would have been totally useless because none of us could have understood him. This is the secret of Jesus, and it needs to be our secret too, that we understand where people are, and it's into their situation that we try and bring the gospel. We don't impose our situation on them, we try and bring the gospel into their situation. Does that kind of answer what you were asking? Hi. Good, I think. Thank you.
So, in regards to that topic, how can you practice sensitivity, compassion, and kindness without getting taken advantage of?
That's a great question. And the first thing I would say is that, like Jesus himself, we have to take the risk. Because the risk will always be there, that people will take advantage of us. So, we talk about these things in a setting like this, and it's very beautiful and it sounds wonderful, but when you translate it into the reality of your life, it's really a big challenge, because there will be people who'll take advantage of us. You think about in the sort of the longer version of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says to you, if someone hits you on one side of the face, turn the other side of the face to them. Don't give up because you're not successful the first time around, and be prepared to cop a bit of grief in the process. So I think that's what it calls for. It actually calls for a lot of courage, but even more than that, it's going to call for a lot of faith, because I can stand up here and say this is what you've got to do, you've got to be strong, you've got to be prepared to take the blows, but we won't be that unless we do what I said at the start and keep our eyes on Jesus. Because it's only with his strength that we'll be able to be these kinds of living images of Jesus that we're called to be. So probably not much consolation, but I think the reality is we are going to have to just take the risk, knowing that it might get thrown back in our face. It got thrown back in the face of Jesus. Jesus tried to be this same kind of person for the religious leaders of his time, and look what they did to him. He tried to be this kind of leader for his own disciples, and all but one of them deserted him or betrayed him. So it is a risk, and we won't be able to take the risk and to withstand the challenges that risk then presents to us on our own. We're going to need the Lord. So it is a risk. The other thing I'd say is that one of the ways in which the Lord helps us in all of this is to give us friends who support us. And one of the great things about World Youth Day is that we realise that there are a whole lot of other people who share the same values that we do. So without creating a kind of a closed group that no one else can get into, I'd encourage all of us to have friends that we know will support us at those difficult times. We'll kind of, when we're falling, they'll lift us up. And then when they're falling, we'll be there to lift them up. So I think having good friends, people that you can share these experiences with, people who can support you, I think that's a key. And it's one of the ways God helps us. So, yeah.
Time for 2 more questions.
Nobody up in the balcony? Say that again? Yep. What are some of the practical ways we can show mercy in our day-to-day lives? Look, I think that's probably a question that each one of us in our own heart of hearts might know the answer to already. But for example, that story I just told you at the start about the young fellow who carried the girl who had an injured foot on his back for a long distance because she was in need and he was able to help. One of the things I think is, and it's a gift that we need to pray for, is to have eyes that are open and on the lookout so we recognise when people need help. The people from Scotland might know about this. Most of the others probably won't have heard about this, but we only have one canonised saint in Australia. Her family came from Scotland. She was born in Melbourne. Her name is St Mary MacKillop. She founded a religious order in Australia called the Josephite Sisters. One of the things she used to say to her sisters, you know how these leaders give lots of good advice to their group, she used to say to the sisters, it's become a famous saying in Australia, she used to say, never see a need without doing something about it. It's a really simple piece of advice until you start to think it through. Because it means that if you're going to be that kind of person, you've got to have eyes that are open and on the lookout to recognise when there are people in need. You've got to have ears that are sort of tuned in to pick up all the different ways in which people are looking for help or are in need. And you've got to have a heart that wants to help. So the practical ways will kind of jump out at us if we let the Lord develop those kinds of eyes and those kinds of ears and that kind of heart. So I'd say it's two things. We need to constantly be asking the Lord to shape us into the kinds of people He's created us to be and wants us to be, and then we'll just know. But it might be as simple as when you're walking back after the catechesis and you see one of your friends is really struggling a bit, so you say, let me take your backpack, I'll carry it for you. They're not necessarily great big things, they can be very simple things. It might be when you're lining up to get your lunch and you step back and say, look, you go first, I've got a bit more time than you have. It's just trying to tune in to be sensitive to the reality of the people around you and then having what it takes to say, I can do something here. So I reckon anyone here would be able to pinpoint already today, since you got up this morning, there've probably been a number of opportunities that some of you might have taken and some of you might have missed in very simple ways to show mercy. You know, if you're walking together as a group and you notice someone's on his or her own, maybe feeling a bit down, maybe just needing a kind word to brighten them up, you're sensitive enough to think, I'll go and say hello. They might not want me to. If I pick up the vibes they're not interested, then I can leave them, but I'll try. So I think it's really about just being tuned in and sensitive. But you've got to have eyes and ears and a heart that want to be that sort of person. And that's a gift from God that we should pray for, not just for ourselves, but for each other.
Thank you, Lord, for the lovely talk that's given us today. I'm from Scotland with a group upstairs, and we're from the University of Glasgow, the Catholic Chaplaincy, and I also am in the Legion of Mary. As we go out to do our Legion work, around the chaplaincy we come across different religious groups. We come across Muslims, Hindus, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and what we go out to do is basically just to bring God's love to them, tell them that God loves you all, tell them how much Jesus loves us and loves us. But at the same time, I know we're also there to, we're not there to sort of, I find it very, very difficult to reach. I find it very difficult to sort of reach common grounds with them, to sort of, and we're not really there to convert them, but we also are there to spread God's love.
Mm-hmm.
How would you then relate to somebody who's a Muslim or a Hindu and try not to really condemn their faith? Because I personally feel it's better to believe that there is a God than to be an atheist and not believe in any God.
Mm.
So when we go out to do our apostolic work, I sometimes struggle when I'm talking to maybe a Muslim or a Hindu. I tell them what I'm doing and why I'm there. And then they tell me that they are a practicing Muslim or a practicing Hindu. And then I just sort of don't quite know what to say to them after that.
Yep.
I know we have to relate to them, listen to them as much as we can, but I also feel we have to stay there, be so good to try and listen to
Yes.
them.
Yes.
How can we then draw them closer to Christ?
Yep. That's a great question, and I think it's in one way, some ways it's a bit of a complicated question, but in other ways perhaps not so much. A couple of things come to mind, and the first one is a saying that is often attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. Now he's big news these days because Pope Francis named himself after Francis of Assisi, and they say no one's too sure whether it's true or not, but if it's not true, it's a great story. They say that Pope Francis, St. Francis used to say to his Franciscan friars, go and preach the gospel everywhere. And if you absolutely have to, use words. So what he's really trying to say is the first and best and most effective way of proclaiming the gospel is by the way you live, by the way you act, by the way you are with people. So that's one part of this. The second part is something that Cardinal Dolan said yesterday to a very similar question that was asked. He said, you've got to avoid two extremes. You've got to avoid the one extreme of being so reticent and so embarrassed and so, unwilling to talk about your faith that you never raise these issues at all. That's one extreme. And I think that's the one that many of us can fall into. The other extreme, in a sense, is to be so full on that you put people off. You've got to, it goes back to this sensitivity thing. You've got to be able to judge whether people are ready. In the end, this is all God's work. And God's the one who works in people's lives to bring them to the point of readiness. If I were to encounter a Muslim or a Hindu and I was talking to them about my faith and I'm a Christian and I believe this and this, and then they said, well, I'm a practicing Muslim, probably the next question I would say was, tell me about the values that are really at the heart of Islam. Talk to me about that. Help me understand that. So you're kind of inviting them into a conversation where they can share what is important to them. And then I'd start looking for the common points and say, oh, that's very similar to Christianity. And it's kind of about creating an environment, an atmosphere of open dialogue, rather than say, I know you wouldn't do this, but rather than say something like, you don't believe that nonsense, do you? Don't you realise that the real truth is this? That's not going to get you very far. It's always good to keep in mind, what is the goal here? What is the Lord using me for in this person's life? And in the end, it's got to be to help that person move forward on the journey of faith. And so if I can put it this way, you choose your strategy in order to make sure that the strategy is going to lead to the desired outcome. And if the strategy is, I'm going to browbeat these people with the truths of Christianity, whether they want to hear them or not, you might feel better at the end, but the other person's gone away and said, well, I've seen that Christian that I was just speaking to, they're absolute fanatic. So you've put them off. We must proclaim the gospel. That's what the Lord has asked us. We believe, as Jesus says himself in the gospel, no one can come to the Father, to God, except through me. That's what we believe. That's who we are. So our goal is to lead people forward to a point in their life where God can take them the next step. Because we're not God. We're not the ones who determine when the conversion happens, how it happens. We're just the instruments that are used by God at any particular stage of a person's journey to lead that person forward to the next point, where they can be ready for the next encounter, which might lead them a bit further forward. I often think that, we get very passionate, as we should, about our faith, very enthusiastic about our faith, and we decide, I'm going to convert this person, and I'm going to convert him now, thank you very much, and we're telling God, right now, thank you, I want him converted today. And God's kind of sitting there in the background saying, well, your timetable and my timetable might be a bit different. Never forget, it's about God at work. He uses us, and we've got to allow him to shape us into the kind of instruments that will achieve what he wants to achieve. So I'd be thinking, when you encounter someone of another faith, to show your openness to understand what lies at the heart of their faith, to enter into dialogue and share with them where the common points between their faith and our faith are, that will hopefully leave them, when the conversation's over, with, if nothing else, a positive sense of an encounter with a Christian, which will leave them open to further encounters. If we act in such a way as to block them off, we've lost them, and God may not this sounds a funny thing to say, God may not get another chance because the chance God wanted to use was through us. It's a strange thing that God kind of ties himself in some sense to us. He wants to work through us. And we're the ones who either can let him work through us or put obstacles in the way. So openness, creating the space for further conversation, that would be my suggested approach. Great question, thank you. Thanks, Gerardo. Well done. Thanks, everybody.